We thought we were the smartest kids in Florida because we found a gap in the rusty perimeter fence that led to a stretch of the coast that didn't even show up on the latest satellite updates of Google Maps. It was one of those humid, heavy afternoons where the air feels like a wet, salty blanket, and the four of us, Mark, Sarah, Chloe, and I, were just desperate to get away from the neon lights and the vomit-stained boardwalks of Destin. Mark had this old, hand-drawn topographic map he'd bought at a garage sale from a man who looked like he'd spent the last 30 years breathing in nothing but brine and cheap tobacco. The map showed a tiny crescent of white sand tucked behind a labyrinth of mangroves and sawgrass, labeled simply as the quiet place in fading, cursive ink. We hiked for nearly 3 hours through the dense underbrush, our coolers heavy and our shins scratched by the jagged palms, but the payoff seemed worth every drop of sweat. When the trees finally broke, we stepped onto a beach so pristine and white it looked like powdered sugar, stretching out toward a gulf that was an impossible, glassy shade of turquoise. There wasn't a single footprint in the sand, not even a stray piece of plastic or a washed-up bottle to suggest another human being had been there in decades. We set up our chairs and cracked open our first round of drinks, laughing about how we discovered our own private paradise, while the rest of the spring break crowd was fighting for space on a public beach 20 miles away. The silence was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic, gentle lap of the water against the shore and the occasional high-pitched cry of a bird we couldn't see. Sarah was the first to notice the weirdness, though at the time, we all just laughed it off as a quirk of the local geography. She pointed out that there were no seashells anywhere on the beach, which is almost unheard of on the Gulf, and instead, the tide line was littered with smooth, bleached white fragments of something else. Mark picked one up, turning the jagged, porous bit of white over in his hand before tossing it back down, and saying it was probably just sun-bleached driftwood that had been tumbled by the waves. A few minutes later, Chloe found something else half buried in the dunes, a small silver bracelet with a class of '98 charm dangling from it, the metal pitted and eroded by years of salt. We joked that some poor girl probably lost it during a secret hookup years ago, never once stopping to wonder why it was buried so deep or why there were no other signs of a campsite nearby. As the afternoon wore on, the heat seemed to intensify, shimmering off the sand in waves that made the horizon look like it was melting into the sky. I remember laying back and closing my eyes, listening to the water, but the sound started to change as the sun began its slow descent toward the water. It wasn't the usual sound of a tide coming in. It was more like a rhythmic, wet dragging sound, as if something heavy was being pulled across the mudflats just beyond the sand. When I opened my eyes, the tide had gone out further than I had ever seen a tide go out in my entire life, exposing hundreds of yards of dark, stinking silt and jagged limestone ribs. The water didn't just recede. It seemed to flee, leaving the ocean floor naked and gasping under the orange glow of the dying sun. That was when I noticed the driftwood piles we had seen earlier weren't actually piles of wood at all. There were dozens of them, scattered across the newly exposed flats, gray and gnarled shapes that I had assumed were just old cedar stumps or logs. As the light shifted to a deep, bruised purple, I saw one of the logs shift its weight, a slow and deliberate movement that sent a cold shiver down my spine despite the 90-degree heat. I nudged Mark, pointing toward a particularly large mound about 50 yards away, and we both watched in total silence as a long, thin limb detached itself from the mass. It wasn't a monster, not in the way you see in movies, but it was something far worse. A person, or what was left of one, coated in a thick layer of gray, sun-dried mud and salt. Their skin was the exact color of the driftwood, cracked and leathery, and they were so thin that their ribs stood out like the hulls of wrecked ships. Then another shape moved, and another, as the driftwood all across the flats began to uncoil from their crouched positions in the muck. They had been there the whole time we were laughing and drinking, sitting perfectly still in the open air, disguised by the sheer stillness of their bodies. They weren't looking at us yet, but were instead moving toward the retreating waterline with a strange, frantic energy, their fingers clawing at the mud as they searched for something. Mark whispered for us to start packing, his voice shaking so badly he could barely get the words out. But Sarah was frozen, her eyes locked on a figure that had just stood up less than 20 feet from our cooler. It was a man, or it had been once, wearing nothing but the remnants of a pair of shredded denim shorts that looked decades old. His hair a matted mess of salt and seaweed. He didn't have the eyes of a predator. He had the eyes of someone who was starving, a hollow, frantic look that made my stomach turn into a knot of ice. He didn't scream or growl. He just made a low, clicking sound in the back of his throat, and suddenly, 3 more of them rose from the dunes behind us. We realized then that we hadn't found a hidden beach. We had stumbled into a pantry, a place where the tide brought in fresh things, and the driftwood waited for the sun to go down. The people on the flats weren't just random outcasts. They were a community, a generational nightmare of feral, salt-caked humans who had been forgotten by the rest of the world. They moved with a terrifying, silent coordination, fanning out to cut off our path back to the mangrove trail. The smell finally hit us then, a stench of rotting fish, old sweat, and something metallic that reminded me of a butcher shop at the end of a long day. Mark grabbed Sarah's hand and yelled for us to run, but the sand that had felt so soft and inviting earlier now felt like deep snow, sucking at our feet and slowing us down. One of them, a woman with skin like wrinkled parchment, lunged at Chloe, her movements jerky and unnatural as if her joints were filled with sand. Chloe screamed as the woman's fingernails, yellow and thick like talons, scraped across her arm, leaving deep red furrows in her tan skin. We didn't stop to help her up. We couldn't, because more of them were emerging from the sawgrass, their gray bodies blending perfectly with the shadows of the evening. They weren't using weapons, just their hands and their teeth, driven by a hunger that seemed ancient and bottomless. I looked back for a split second and saw Mark go down, not because he tripped, but because one of them had been buried in the sand right beneath where his chair had been. The driftwood he had been leaning his head against for 3 hours had been a person waiting for the light to fail. I didn't see him get back up, and I can still hear the sound of the clicking noise growing louder, a chorus of dry tongues hitting the roofs of mouths. We reached the mangroves, the branches tearing at our clothes and skin, but the sounds of the pursuit didn't stop behind us. I could hear them breathing, a wet, whistling sound that suggested their lungs were as ruined by the salt as their skin was. I don't know where Sarah or Chloe are now. I lost them in the darkness of the swamp when I fell into a brackish pool and had to crawl through the muck to hide. I've been huddling in the hollow of a rotted cypress tree for what feels like hours, watching the flickering orange glow of a fire back on the beach. I can hear them singing now, if you can call it that, a wordless, droning hum that rises and falls with the sound of the wind in the trees. Every time a twig snaps nearby, I freeze, praying that the mud I've smeared over my skin is enough to hide my scent from them. I found Mark's phone in my pocket earlier, but there's no signal out here, just the glowing screen showing me that it's 3:00 a.m. and the battery is at 4%. The worst part isn't the thought of dying. It's the realization that when the sun comes up, they'll just go back to the beach and sit down. They'll cover themselves in mud and salt and wait for the next group of kids with an old map to show up and think they've found paradise. I can see a shape moving through the trees about 20 yards away, a gray, skeletal figure that is sniffing the air with a slow, methodical hunger. It stopped moving now, and it's looking directly toward my tree, its body perfectly still, mimicking the shape of a dead branch. I'm riding this because I don't think I can stay quiet much longer. The mosquitoes are thick, and my breath is coming in short, ragged gasps that feel like thunder in the silence. If you find a map at a garage sale that talks about the quiet place, please, for the love of God, just stay indefinite. The tide is starting to turn, and I can hear the water coming back in, but the clicking sounds are getting closer, and they sound so very hungry. I can see its eyes now, reflecting the tiny bit of light left on my phone screen, and it's not moving, just waiting for me to make a sound. I think it's been waiting for a very long time. There is no one coming to help, and the sun is still hours away from rising over the gulf. I can feel the salt in the air, stinging my eyes, and the sound of the dragging feet is right outside the hollow of the tree. I'm going to turn off the phone now and hope that the darkness is enough to keep me as invisible as they were. But I can hear the clicking right behind my ear, and the smell of the salt is overwhelming. They don't want our money or our beer. They just want the salt in our blood. The phone is dying, and the driftwood is finally reaching out its hand. The heat coming off the asphalt in the Mojave Desert feels like a physical weight pressing against the windshield, a shimmering haze that turns the horizon into a liquid blur. We were 6 hours into a drive that was supposed to take 8, but the old Honda Civic's air conditioning had given up somewhere near the Arizona border, leaving us to stew in our own sweat. My friend Tyler was passed out in the passenger seat, his mouth slightly open and a thin line of drool escaping onto his chin. In the back, Sarah and Leo were entangled in a messy, uncomfortable sleep, their limbs draped over a cooler filled with lukewarm Gatorade and half-eaten sandwiches. The silence of the desert is something you don't really understand until you're in the middle of it. A vast, oppressive quiet that makes every little rattle of the car's interior sound like a gunshot. I remember staring at the road ahead, watching the white lines disappear under the hood with a hypnotic regularity that made my eyes heavy. Every few miles, a dusty Joshua tree would drift past the window, its twisted limbs looking like a person frozen in a permanent state of distress. It was the kind of landscape that makes you feel incredibly small and insignificant, which I suppose was the entire point of this spring break trip after months of being crammed into tiny, windowless dorm rooms. The radio had long since faded into a steady, rhythmic hiss of static, but I kept the volume low just to drown out the unsettling sound of my own shallow breathing. I reached for my water bottle, my fingers sticking to the plastic, and took a sip of liquid that was nearly as hot as the air outside. That's when I first noticed the shape in the rearview mirror, a dull, dark smudge against the orange glow of the setting sun. It was just a black SUV, probably a Suburban or a Tahoe, sitting a few hundred yards back and maintaining my exact speed of 65 miles per hour. I didn't think anything of it at first because, despite the isolation of this particular stretch of highway, people do actually use these roads to get between the small mining towns. But as the sun dipped below the jagged peaks of the distant mountains and the desert turned a deep, bruised shade of purple, I realized the SUV hadn't turned on its headlights. I checked my own lights, clicking the dial on and off to make sure they were actually functioning, and the yellow glare hit the reflective road signs ahead with a comforting brightness. I looked back again, expecting to see 2 pinpricks of light behind me, but there was nothing but a dark silhouette cutting through the deepening twilight. I figured maybe their lights were broken, or they were just some local who knew every curve of the road well enough to drive by the faint moonlight. It was a stupid, rationalizing thought, but your brain tries to make sense of anomalies when you're tired and dehydrated in the middle of nowhere. I slowed down to 55 to let them pass, hoping they would just roar by and leave us in their dust, but they slowed down too. They kept that same exact distance between our bumpers, a cold, mechanical shadow that refused to close the gap or fall behind. Tyler stirred and groaned, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, and I pointed out the dark shape that was now barely visible in the gloom. He squinted through the dusty rear window for a long minute, his brow furrowed in confusion, before shrugging and saying they probably just didn't want to drain their battery if they had an alternator issue. I could tell he was unsettled, though, because he didn't go back to sleep. He just sat there, staring at the side mirror with a tense expression. We hit a fork in the road about 20 miles later, a minor detour that led toward a small, rundown gas station we'd seen on a crumpled paper map earlier that day. I decided to take the turn without using my blinker, a sudden, sharp impulse to see if the SUV was truly following us or if I was just being paranoid. My heart hammered against my ribs with a frantic, uneven beat when the black SUV pivoted smoothly onto the narrow, cracked access road behind us. No blinker, no brake lights, just a silent, fluid movement that felt more predatory than accidental in the growing dark. We pulled into the gas station, a place that looked like it hadn't seen a fresh coat of paint since the Carter administration, and I parked right under the flickering fluorescent lights. The SUV didn't pull into the lot. It just stopped on the gravel shoulder of the road about 50 yards away, its engine idling with a low, throaty rumble. I could feel the vibration of that engine in the soles of my feet, a deep bass note that seemed to vibrate through the very frame of our car. Sarah and Leo woke up then, their voices groggy and filled with the confusion of being startled out of a deep sleep. I told them to stay in the car, my voice sounding thin and brittle even to my own ears, and I stepped out into the dry night air. The desert at night is cold, a sharp contrast to the baking heat of the day, and the wind carried the scent of sagebrush and old oil. I walked toward the gas station's main door, my shadow stretching out long and distorted under the buzzing lights of the canopy. The door was locked, and a faded closed sign was swinging gently in the wind behind the glass, which was coated in a thick layer of desert grime. I turned back toward the car and saw that the SUV had moved closer, now sitting just at the edge of the station's pool of light. I could see that the windows were tinted so darkly, they looked like slabs of polished obsidian, reflecting nothing but the empty, black desert. I didn't see a driver, didn't see a face, just the blank, expressionless front of the vehicle staring me down like a predator. I scrambled back into the driver's seat, fumbling with the keys as my hands shook uncontrollably, and told everyone to buckle up because we were leaving right now. Tyler didn't argue, and the back seat was silent as Sarah and Leo stared out the rear window at the dark shape that was now less than 30 feet away. As I peeled out of the station, the tires spitting gravel against the rusted pumps, the SUV lurched forward with terrifying ease. We were back on the main road within seconds, and I pushed the Civic as hard as I dared, the engine screaming as the speedometer climbed toward 80. The black shape stayed glued to our bumper, still without a single light showing, a void in the night that seemed to swallow the light from our own taillights. I decided to try a desperate move and pulled a sharp U-turn in a wide, sandy turnout, thinking I could lose them in the massive dust cloud we'd kick up. But as I spun the wheel and the car groaned under the lateral force, the SUV didn't follow us through the turn. It stopped dead in the middle of the road, and for the first time, I saw the driver's side door swing open with a slow, deliberate motion. A man stepped out, but he didn't look like the kind of monster you'd expect to see in a horror movie. He was wearing a neon yellow reflective vest, the kind used by construction workers or roadside assistance technicians, which glowed brightly in our headlights. He didn't run toward us, and he didn't pull a weapon from his belt. He just stood there with his feet planted wide. He was holding a small, handheld radio to his mouth, his head tilted as if he were listening to a response over the static. He wasn't looking at us at all. He was looking past us, toward the dark stretch of highway we were now heading back down. That's when the realization hit me like a physical blow to the stomach, a sickening wave of dread that made my breath catch in my throat. The SUV hadn't been chasing us away from safety. It had been herding us like cattle toward a specific point further down the road. I looked ahead into the pitch-black stretch of highway we were now racing toward and saw a row of heavy, metallic spikes laid out across the asphalt. They glinted faintly in my headlights, a serrated line of steel that was impossible to avoid at the speed we were traveling. I slammed on the brakes, but the car skidded on the loose sand at the edge of the pavement, and the tires hit the spikes with a series of wet, explosive pops. The steering wheel jerked violently out of my hands as the front tires shredded, sending the Civic sliding sideways into a shallow, rocky ditch. The sound of the crash was deafening, a symphony of grinding metal and shattering glass that seemed to go on for an eternity. We scrambled out of the wreckage, coughing on the acrid smoke from the deployed airbags and the thick dust hanging in the air. Sarah was crying, a high-pitched, hysterical sound, while Leo tried to help her stand up on the uneven ground. We looked back toward the road where the black SUV was slowly rolling toward us, its headlights finally clicking on with a blinding, clinical white glare. But it wasn't just one set of lights that cut through the darkness of the Mojave night. From the shadows of the desert floor on either side of the road, dozens of other sets of headlights flickered to life, one after another. They surrounded the crash site in a perfect, glowing circle, their beams crossing over the wreckage of our car like spotlights on a stage. No one was shouting commands. No one was demanding our wallets. And there were no police sirens wailing in the distance to offer any hope of rescue. We are sitting in the dirt now, huddling together behind the crumpled frame of the Honda, watching the silhouettes of men stepping out of the vehicles. They are beginning to walk toward us in a slow, synchronized line, their footsteps heavy and deliberate on the desert crust. They aren't carrying guns or knives. They are carrying heavy-duty zip ties and long rolls of thick, industrial plastic sheeting. Plastic crinkles rhythmically with every step they take, a dry, metallic sound that carries clearly through the still night air. I pulled my phone out of my pocket, but the screen just shows a no service icon where the signal bars should be. The men are only 20 feet away now, their faces obscured by the glare of the headlights behind them, making them look like featureless shadows. The last thing I can hear over the sound of Sarah's sobbing is the low, steady hum of a portable generator being started up somewhere in the dark behind the trucks. They aren't in a hurry, because they know there is nowhere left for us to run in this vast, empty sea of sand. The man in the yellow vest is the last to approach, and he's still talking into his radio, his voice calm and professional. He looks down at us with no more emotion than a butcher looking at a side of beef, and he nods once to the men with the plastic. The circle of light is closing in, and the desert has never felt more silent than it does right now. We are just waiting for the first hand to reach out and pull us into the glare. I can see the texture of the plastic sheeting now, the way it catches the light, and I know exactly what it's for. My fingers are digging into the dry earth, searching for a rock, a weapon, anything at all, but there is nothing but dust. Tyler is whispering a prayer I don't recognize, his voice cracking with every syllable. The first man reaches the edge of the ditch and pauses, waiting for the others to catch up so they can move as one. The silence is broken only by the sound of our own terrified breathing and the distant, rhythmic thumping of the generator. I close my eyes, but the white light of the headlights still burns through my eyelids, a constant reminder that they are still there. I wonder how many other cars have ended up in this ditch, and how many other people have sat exactly where I am sitting. The desert keeps its secrets well, buried under layers of sand and the indifferent heat of the sun. The first hand reaches out, its grip firm and cold against my arm, and I realize that the SUV was never the monster. The monster is the system that put it there. The quiet, organized efficiency of the men now dragging us toward the light. We are just another task on a checklist, a minor inconvenience to be processed and cleared away before the sun comes up. The plastic begins to unroll with a loud, sharp snap, and the world finally goes dark. The sun was so bright it felt like it was physically pushing against my eyelids. As I lay by the infinity pool at the Azure Sanctuary, I could hear the rhythmic clinking of ice cubes against glass from the swim-up bar about 20 feet away, a sound that had become the heartbeat of our spring break trip. My best friend, Leo, was snoring lightly in the lounge chair next to me, his chest rising and falling in that deep, rhythmic way that only happens after a morning spent drinking premium tequila under a tropical sun. Everything about the resort felt too perfect. From the way the turquoise water blended seamlessly into the horizon to the scent of expensive coconut-scented sunblock that seemed to hang perpetually in the humid air. It was one of those all-inclusive places where you never have to carry a wallet, and the staff seemed to anticipate your needs before you even fully realized you had them. I remember thinking how lucky we were to have found a last-minute cancellation at a place this prestigious, especially during the peak of the March rush. The resort was a fortress of luxury, cut off from the local villages by miles of dense, overgrown jungle and a private coastline that felt entirely ours. We had spent the first 3 days in a haze of salt water and high-end buffets, barely noticing the world outside our little bubble of indulgence. It wasn't until the fourth afternoon that I noticed the first thing that didn't quite fit into the postcard-perfect reality we were living in. I was waiting at the towel station for a fresh wrap when I saw a girl named Sarah, who we'd shared drinks with the night before, standing by the hibiscus hedge. She was wearing the exact same yellow bikini she'd had on yesterday, but she wasn't moving, just staring at a point somewhere over the ocean with a wide, unchanging smile. I called out her name, waving a hand to get her attention, but she didn't even blink or turn her head in my direction. When one of the resort staff members, a tall man in a crisp white polo, approached her, he didn't say a word. He just gently took her by the elbow and led her toward the service elevators. I figured she just had a bit too much sun, or perhaps a bit too much of the resort's heavy-handed pouring, and I went back to my chair without a second thought. That evening at dinner, Leo pointed out that the couple we'd played volleyball with earlier seemed oddly quiet at the table next to ours. They were sitting perfectly upright, their hands folded neatly in their laps, staring at their untouched plates of seared tuna with those same fixed, pleasant expressions. It wasn't a vacant look exactly, but it was a look of intense, forced contentment that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up for reasons I couldn't explain. I laughed it off, telling Leo that maybe the all-inclusive deal included some kind of experimental relaxation therapy we hadn't signed up for yet. But when I went to the bathroom and passed the kitchen doors, I heard the sound of several people sobbing, a muffled, desperate noise that was quickly drowned out by the upbeat lounge music playing over the speakers. I paused, my hand on the cold brass handle of the restroom door, listening for a repeat of the sound, but it was gone as quickly as it had started. When I returned to our table, Leo was gone, his napkin neatly folded on his chair as if he'd just stepped away for a moment. I waited for 20 minutes, then 30, watching the other guests around me who all seemed to be moving with a strange, synchronized grace. I noticed then that the staff were no longer speaking to the guests. They were merely nodding and pointing, their smiles identical and unyielding. I decided to head back to our suite, thinking Leo might have just felt tired and headed in early without telling me. The hallways of the resort felt longer than they had this morning, the cream-colored walls closing in as the dim evening lights cast long, distorted shadows on the carpet. When I reached our room, the door was slightly ajar, and the smell of heavy floral perfume and something metallic, like copper, wafted out into the hall. I pushed the door open slowly, my heart thumping against my ribs like a trapped bird, and saw Leo sitting on the edge of his bed. He was wearing his favorite Hawaiian shirt, but his hair was combed back with a precision I'd never seen him use in the 10 years I'd known him. I called his name softly, relieved to see him, but he didn't jump or look up with the usual sarcastic comment I expected. He turned his head slowly, his neck clicking audibly in the quiet room, and looked at me with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. His eyes were wide, the pupils dilated until they were nearly all black, reflecting my own terrified face back at me like two dark mirrors. I reached out to touch his shoulder, and as my fingers brushed the fabric of his shirt, I realized he wasn't just sitting there. He was trembling with a fine, high-frequency vibration. He didn't speak, but his mouth moved as if he were trying to form words that had been surgically removed from his memory. I backed away, tripping over my own suitcase, and that's when I noticed the small, red marks around his hairline, hidden just beneath the fringe of his hair. They looked like tiny, precise punctures, the kind you'd get from a stapler or a very fine surgical needle, encircling his entire skull. I scrambled to my feet and ran back into the hallway, slamming the door behind me, only to find 2 staff members standing right there, waiting. They didn't grab me or shout. They just stood in the center of the corridor, blocking my path to the lobby with those same unwavering, hospitable grins. I realized then that they weren't clones or supernatural entities, but something much more terrifyingly human. I could see the subtle scars behind their ears, the way their skin seemed stretched a little too tight over their cheekbones, and the dullness in their gaze that suggested the people they used to be were buried under layers of trauma and chemicals. They were the guests from the previous week, or perhaps the week before that, transformed into the very staff that was now tending to us. The all-inclusive nature of the resort wasn't about the food or the drinks, but about the total absorption of the person into the machinery of the estate. Every guest was a raw material, a fresh body to be harvested, reprogrammed, and put back out into the sun to serve the next batch of arrivals. I ducked into a service stairwell, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I realized the elevators had been disabled from the outside. The air in the stairwell was cold and smelled of bleach and old blood, a sharp contrast to the tropical flowers blooming just beyond the glass. I descended 3 flights, hoping to find a back exit or a laundry chute, anything that would lead me away from the manicured grounds. I found myself in a sterile, white-tiled basement, where the sound of industrial fans hummed a low, vibrating note that I could feel in my teeth. Through a half-open door, I saw a row of dental-style chairs, each occupied by a guest who had been reported missing or resting over the past few days. A man in a surgeon's gown was carefully stitching a new set of expressions onto a woman's face, his movements methodical and chillingly efficient. There were no monitors, no high-tech gadgets, just a collection of sharp instruments and jars of thick, yellowing liquid that smelled like formaldehyde. I realized with a jolt of pure ice in my veins that they were doing this by hand, a systematic stripping of identity to create the perfect, silent workforce. The woman on the chair didn't scream because her vocal cords had been neatly severed, her only outlet for pain being the single tear tracking through the antiseptic on her cheek. I turned to run, but my foot caught on a stray cable, sending a metal tray of scalpels clattering to the floor with a sound like a thunderclap. The surgeon stopped his work, his head tilting to the side in a curious, bird-like gesture, and then he smiled at me. It wasn't a threatening smile, but a welcoming one, the kind you give to a guest who has finally arrived at the party. I bolted back up the stairs, my lungs burning, until I burst through the doors leading out to the main terrace. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in violent shades of purple and orange, making the whole resort look like it was on fire. I saw dozens of them now, the guest stern staff, standing along the edge of the infinity pool, their silhouettes dark against the glowing water. They were all watching me, not with anger, but with a patient expectation that made me want to scream until my throat bled. I looked for the front gate, but the lush jungle had been meticulously trimmed to hide the high concrete walls, topped with jagged glass and electrified wire. There was no way out of the sanctuary, no boat coming to the dock, no phone line that wasn't monitored by the smiling men in white polos. I saw Leo standing near the bar, holding a tray with 2 tropical drinks, the little umbrellas bobbing in the breeze. He walked toward me, his gait slightly stiff but perfectly poised, and offered me one of the glasses with a steady hand. His eyes met mine, and for a split second, I thought I saw a flash of the old Leo, a scream trapped behind the glass of his pupils, begging me to run. But then the light shifted, and all I saw was the reflection of the sunset and the blank, terrifying piece of his new existence. He didn't say a word, just pushed the glass closer to my hand, the condensation dripping like sweat onto my skin. I looked around at the beautiful, horrific perfection of the resort, and realized that the screaming I'd heard earlier hadn't been from the kitchen. It had been from the transition, the sound of a human being stripped away to make room for a mannequin. I backed away toward the edge of the pool, the water cold against my heels, as the circle of staff began to close in, their smiles widening in unison. They weren't in a hurry because they knew I had nowhere to go, and the night was long enough for all of us. I could hear the sound of the ocean waves crashing against the cliffs below, a wild, chaotic sound that was the only honest thing left in this place. One of the women, who I recognized as a honeymooner from the flight in, reached out a hand to steady me, her touch cold and firm. She leaned in close, her breath smelling of peppermint and nothing else, and whispered a single word that wasn't a word at all, just a soft, rhythmic clicking of her teeth. I looked down at the drink Leo was still holding out to me, the red liquid shimmering like a pool of fresh blood in the dying light. I knew that once I took a sip, the transition would begin, the chemicals dulling the fear until I was ready for the chair in the basement. The silence of the resort was absolute now, the music having cut out, leaving only the sound of 30 people breathing in perfect, haunting synchronization. I realized they didn't want to kill me. They wanted me to stay here forever, a permanent fixture of the Azure Sanctuary. I felt the woman's grip tighten on my arm, her fingers like steel bands under her soft skin, guiding me back toward the main building. I looked up at the stars, which were just beginning to poke through the twilight, wondering if anyone back home would ever realize we hadn't just extended our trip. The resort would send the emails, post the fake photos to our social media, and keep the charade going until the next group of lucky guests arrived. My hand shook as it moved toward the glass, my fingers brushing the cool surface of the pineapple garnish Leo had carefully placed there. He nodded, his smile growing even wider, his head tilting at that same unnatural angle as the surgeon's. I took the glass from his hand, the weight of it feeling like a death sentence, and looked one last time at the dark wall of the jungle. There was no rescue coming, no sudden realization from the outside world that would shatter this polished, smiling nightmare. I brought the rim of the glass to my lips, the sweet, cloying scent of the drink filling my nose, and felt the first drop of the sedative touch my tongue. The world started to blur at the edges, the sharp lines of the palm trees softening into a hazy, golden glow that felt almost like safety. I didn't fight as they led me toward the service elevator, my own face already beginning to settle into a mask of polite, unshakable contentment. As the doors slid shut, the last thing I saw was the moon reflecting off the water, a cold, white eye watching the resort as it prepared for the next day's check-ins.